A couple of coworkers were talking, and one of the ladies said that she was interested in starting a new diet. And her friend said that she said, well, that's interesting. I would be interested in doing that too. Maybe I'll do a diet with you. We'll encourage each other. We can talk about some plans and ideas together. And if either one of us has kind of a weak time, then we'll let the other one know. And she says, her friend says, I think that's a great idea. We'll work together. And I'm going to start bringing my lunch every day. But if I ever forget my lunch, or if I ever say that I just really need to go out and get me a hamburger and some French fries, I'll let you know. And her friend says, oh, that would be a great idea, because I'd like to ride with you. Okay. Yes. So we are in week 3 of a series I've been calling Less Than. And we recognize that the overall story, the narrative of Scripture, is that God created us as His children. Then there was a fall because of sin, and that relationship between God our Father and us as His children, that relationship was broken. And then we've been walking through history. God began the process of redeeming His children and even restoring us in relationship with Him. And one day waiting now for a time when we are redeemed and reconciled fully and completely with Him in heaven. Now, the first week, as we began talking about that, we looked at that idea that from the fall, from the point that sin entered the world, we were separated from God. Relationship with Him was broken. And it all changed. Now we're waiting and looking forward to that time when glory is made available to us. But in the meantime, we're living a life that's less than what God designed us for. We're living a relationship with Him that is not what He had first made available. I mean, back when Adam and Eve were walking in the garden, they walked with Him and they could talk with Him, and He came down right into their presence. And I don't know, what kind of images that brings up and stuff, but I just kind of see the three of them sitting on a rock somewhere, just enjoying each other, maybe telling stories of their day and laughing over something silly that happened. Who knows what that could have been like? But we live now in a time when that relationship has been altered and changed. And the second week, we looked at how God had started taking steps to restore that fellowship back to Him. We looked at God's covenant with Abraham and then how God came down in the person of Jesus Christ, how He died upon the cross and made forgiveness available that we could be reconciled to God. And so this week, we're going to talk about a couple of these postures that we mentioned in the first week, where we still, even having the availability of the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, we still might live in a posture that's less than what God has made available or designed. We might have a relationship with Him that's less than what it could be. I'd mentioned that I've been reading a book called With by Skye Jethani. I showed a video the first week to kind of open this up. Skye asserted that most religion is about trying to make sense of our world, trying to figure it out, how to overcome and take control of our fears that arise out of the diversity, the scarcity, the struggles, the problems, the stress, and so on. Now, I mentioned I've been reading his book. It's called With. And he goes on to even talk about how in this crazy world that we live in, that seems not only dangerous, but often confusing. It seems unfair. It seems unpredictable. That he says we try to make sense of what's going on. We try to figure out how we can take control of our situation. And we're going to look at the implications of these claims, even on Christianity. But first, a way of maybe giving you some hope this morning, I want us to consider 1 John 4, 18 and 19. As John is talking about some of the struggles and problems in our world, he says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. We love because he first loved us. God has given us his love, and he wants us to enter back into that relationship with him, that we would know him again as our Father, that we would know him again as our provider, that we would know him again as our protector, and that we would trust him with our lives. And because God loved us, and he demonstrated that love for us by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross, we know that we can be forgiven of that sin that has separated us from him, and we can enter back into relationship with God our Father. Now, from week 1, we heard about the 4 different postures that we might take, each of which are less than the relationship God has made available to us. I'll remind you of the 4, and then we're going to talk about the first 2 this morning. The 4 that he suggested were life under God, which looks at following rules and rituals to relate to God. Life over God, which talks about learning principles to take control of our own life. Life from God, which says we're just interested in God's blessings and help. Or life for God, which says we try to find meaning and purpose just by service and mission. Now, we'll talk about the first 2 today, and as we look at these examples of what this posture might look like, we'll look first at other religions. We'll also look at kind of popular worldviews. And then we might even look at what the implications and practices might be even in our Christian faith. Step by step, kind of walking closer to some personal questions and some personal evaluation of what does this mean to us. And I got to say, this has really kind of been messing with my mind a little bit the last couple of weeks that I've been pondering some of these thoughts. So this first one is called life under God. Let's look at some scripture before we talk about it. In Luke chapter 18, and you could turn to this one if you want, because we'll read this parable that Jesus was telling one day. It says this: he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithe of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So let's talk first about this idea or this posture before God of life under God. In this posture, religious adherents see themselves as subjugates under a divine being. As such, they must follow certain practices, rules, and sacrifices to appease their God and win his favor. Religious festivals, animal sacrifices, even sexual rituals have been used throughout history to be used for the purpose of appeasing gods and attracting their blessings. In the earliest days, people had little understanding of why our world operated and acted the way it did. Why would the sun rise in the morning? Why do crops grow? Why are the crops better this year than they were last year? There was certainly little explanation of why rain would fall a certain amount one year and a different amount the next year, if even a flood one year and a drought the next. Surely there must be great and mysterious forces at work, but how can we find relief? How can we navigate this confusion? And how can we maybe do things that would help bring the kinds of outcomes in our world that we need even to survive? I read one story about villagers, and that this is a common practice in certain southern villages that were inflicted by some kind of sickness or plague. And they didn't know how to get rid of the disease and how to find healing from this. And so there were some that practiced taking either an animal or even another human villager intentionally inflicting them with the disease and sending them away into the wilderness like a scapegoat, hoping that the disease would follow them out of their community, out of their village, saving the people who were left behind, though condemning the one that was caused to leave. And the hope was the disease might be lifted this way. It seems to me that even though we look at how over the years, many different religious practices use all kinds of different religions, rituals. They might use different kinds of prayers. They have different kinds of sacrifices. Everything from paying homage to maybe living in solitude and silence, animal sacrifice, all kinds of things. And certainly we see elements of this even in early Judaism, and then even some elements of this in later Christianity. And that the same posture before the one true God of Abraham is still quite common and deeply ingrained in the Christian faith as well. In some ways, as it should be. We understand that God sits on the throne. We understand that he's the creator and that he is the one that has spoken all things into existence. And we understand that he is even the one that has given us his word to guide our lives, his spirit to be with us and to show us the path. And because of this, there are beliefs that we have come to practice on great regularity. But sometimes we believe that it is the following of these laws, or it is the participation in various religious practices, that if we do enough, we can get good things from God, even though maybe in his name. Even to the point of believing, or is it possible that we sometimes believe that if we do enough, therefore God owes us? God is responsible or even obligated to do certain things for us. Case in point, November 2010, Buffalo Bills receiver Steve Johnson blamed God for missing a game-winning reception. I think there's a picture. This is the actual moment when he missed. He broke away from his defenders. He's in the end zone all alone. The quarterback drops the ball right in his lap, and he still missed it. And they went on to lose the game. Yes, that evening he tweeted out this: "I praise you 24/7, and this how you do me? You expect me to learn from this? How? I will never forget this ever. Thanks, though." It was one of those tweets that went around the world as everyone recognized that Steve Johnson was blaming God for causing him to miss that catch, and that because he had praised God and spent his life, spent in his mind sufficient amount of time praising God, that God owed it to him to help him in that way. It kind of answers, now I forgot his name. Carlin, there's a comedian / atheist, Carlin. Let me remember George Carlin. He actually talked at some length about how he was tired of listening to sports figures praise God when they got the catch or won the game, but nobody seemed to say anything when they lost, and that it seemed unbalanced in his mind. Well, he got his answer back in 2010. And here's an example of somebody said, "Hey, I've done it. I've prayed. I've praised. I've worshiped. Don't you owe me, God, aren't you obligated, God, to bless me the way I want?" Well, let's consider our story in Luke chapter 18. Jesus' parable about the Pharisee who prayed. Now, Pharisees, they were not only Jews, they were leaders of Jews. They were the ones in charge and the religious leaders of their time. And here he's gone to the temple. He's left his home. He's left his life. He's left his situation, whatever that might be. He's taken the time to walk to the temple. He's gone in. He's knelt down. He's prayed before the Lord. And he starts to explain to God why he's a good guy. God, I'm fair in all that I do. I follow your commandments, God. I keep the rules that you've laid out. I keep myself sexually pure in all ways. Here we see him praying to God. He mentions how he fasts twice a week. He even tithes on everything that God has given to him. Pharisees were known for being so particular. Jesus talks about this too. They were so particular in their tithing, they might even tithe all the way down to the spices in their cabinets in the kitchen. Now, obviously, Jesus is not saying that these things are unimportant or they don't matter or that he shouldn't keep to these kinds of practices. Of course, we should live a life of holiness and devotion. But Jesus did say that though this man has done all these things, he still leaves the presence of God unjustified. He goes home no different than when he arrived. He felt he deserved God's favor. He felt he deserved God's blessing. He felt that because he lived his life under God, he was more important than the sinner and the tax collector that was there in the room across the way. And sometimes people will get their life into trouble, and because they're searching for help and answers, suddenly they show up in church. Sandy and I were talking about a little bit this week, times maybe when we were younger, when we made deals with God. Get me out of this jam, Lord. Kind of those backseat of the police car prayers, right? God, help me out of this and I will go to church on Sunday. Or even, I've noticed it the other way around. People start off, you see them in church and you see them growing, and then trouble comes. Trouble hits. Suddenly they give up. They go, well, wait a minute. This wasn't the deal. I didn't know that this was the bargain. I thought if I did these things, then my life should be protected. My life should be blessed. I thought this was the Midas touch here. And they figure out that this Jesus stuff, it just isn't working. But the reality is it's usury. It's trying to take what God offers in terms of relationship, and it makes it into something almost ugly. I paid up, God, and now you owe me. God doesn't want us to use him as our spiritual slave. He says, I love you. I've called you my bride. But we're only sometimes satisfied with making him a spiritual prostitute. If I pay if I give, then he has to take care of me. Is there any implication here for you? Certainly something to think about. Okay, let's talk about the second one. Life over God. This one's really interesting too. It's kind of the opposite end of the deal, where sometimes we can live without hardly any thought towards God at all. Somewhere in the early 1500s, we started moving out of what is commonly referred to as the Dark Ages and began entering what has been called the scientific revolution. Actually about the 1600s when Sir Isaac Newton, and you're probably familiar with some kind of legend that he was sitting under an apple tree and an apple fell down and hit him on the head, and he discovered gravity. And that's probably not quite the way it happened, but he did seem to become curious about what are these mysterious forces and energies that seem to draw the earth and the apple together. And he was trying to figure that out and what that meant and how it happened. And with my football, if I was to throw it out, why doesn't it just keep on going and float away, up to the top of the ceiling or something? Instead, the gravity that brings it back down. Well, it was an era of new discovery. It was an era of understanding and intellectual enlightenment. Superstition was replaced with science. Ignorance was finding understanding. And religion was beginning a walk into oblivion. We could now understand how this world works all on our own. We could figure out things for ourselves. We didn't really need God anymore. In fact, if he couldn't be weighed on a scale or touched with your hand or measured with some kind of a ruler, did God even exist at all? Those became the only ways by which we now are allowed to try to figure out how this world works. Scientific revolution was a series of events marked with the emergence of modern science during this early modern period, and developments in mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, human anatomy, chemistry, transformed the views of society and nature itself. And we began to realize that we could figure out a lot of our life all on our own. If we could just get smarter, if we could just figure things out better, then maybe we can mitigate some of these dangerous things that we're afraid of. Right. So it became popular to live this life over God, where I can be in charge. I just need some principles. I just need some tools. I just need some knowledge. I just need some understanding, and then I can kind of take things from there. In fact, later on in some of our history, it became pretty popular to even see that religion was now the problem. When it used to be the answer, now it's actually the problem. You might remember 1971, John Lennon released a song called Imagine. His most famous song, it's engraved in his tombstone, the word imagine. And it says this: imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, only above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. See, religion's the problem. If we could get rid of religion, and we could get rid of politics, and we could get rid of country boundaries and the things that divide us, then maybe that's how we would be able to finally figure out ways to get along. Skye Jethani writes about this, and he says it's really interesting that one day when John Lennon was receiving an award and honors for the song he wrote, that across town, the Los Angeles Times reported about an atheist convention that broke out into fights and skirmishes over issues of scientific facts. So, obliterating religion still left room for people to disagree and to even fight and battle over things that they felt, ideas they held on to. So not only are we better off figuring out this world on our own without God, but many people believe that religion actually became the problem. Science has become more and more popular, and religion is often labeled nonsense and superstition. Scientific intelligence grew. Religious adherents are considered blind fools of ignorance and stupidity. And we began living a life over God. We can do this without him. And we can even make this life and this world a better place without him. Now, to be fair, science has not replaced God altogether. You might find it interesting to note that most people, even in the United States, still believe in God. A 2014 survey commissioned by the Pew Research Center for Religion found that only 5% of the country believe in no God, that there is no God. Only 5% of our country believes that there is no God. And even in that 5%, it's a fairly small percentage of them that would actually say there is no God, and most of them believe they don't know what is out there, and they stay just open to anything that we don't understand. So the problem is not that we don't believe that God exists. The problem seems to be ever increasing that we believe that God is no longer involved in our world. So we are more, or at least almost as spiritual as we've ever been. But the sense on the street, if you will, the belief in our culture is mostly that God just doesn't get his hands dirty with us anymore. Some have used the analogy of a watch to prove the existence of God. If you've heard this one, the logic goes like this. If you were walking along a path and found a beautiful pocket watch laying on the ground, you would pick it up, and as you began to look at it, you wouldn't say, boy, this is a beautiful piece. I imagine some hurricane blew through a junkyard of trash, picking up gears and springs and pieces, and somehow has merged it all together into this beautiful piece. No, instead, a pocket watch demonstrates intelligence, craftsmanship, and design. So too, there is no way to look around at the precision, the beauty, and the wonder of our universe without concluding that it is clearly the evidence of a divine creator. However, even if we accept certain truths about that kind of logic, we can still look at that watch as though it has been wound up, set into time, and then the creator has taken his hands off of it, and it can operate even though he stepped back behind the curtain of heaven to let it run out throughout its days. It's relatively easy to live our lives thinking that we can take God's principles from the Bible, add in our own hard work and knowledge, and we alone can solve our problems, live our lives, and choose our own destinies on our own. For some time now, many who love the Lord but have identified him through this kind of a life under God posture have become skeptical of those that are trying to live their life over God, as perhaps we should. But we've seen some interesting shifts in the church in the last about 40 years. As the church growth model has emerged, many people turn to leadership principles as a way of controlling growth in the church. Leadership seminars and attraction-based programs and principles are employed to build ever-increasing larger churches all across the country. Not that a big church is inherently bad, but there are persistent questions about these church models. Some are asking the question, has worship been replaced by Broadway production? Are pastors the new celebrities? Are we now able to grow a church full of thousands of people, even if God never showed up at all? Now, not that the church of several decades ago they really loved the Lord anymore. They had their own system of how to get God's favor, as we talked before. We've just exchanged life under God for a life that's over him. And we might ask the question, can we learn to live our life with God? Can we live our life with him? And what does that look like? What does that mean? That was the point of Jesus' parable. The Pharisee lived his life under God, following the rules and keeping his practices, thinking that he has done his part. But Jesus added in a second character, this tax collector. Though he doesn't share much about him, we can probably assume that because he was in the temple, because he was praying, and because most of the tax collectors of Jesus' day and stories were actually Jews, who, however, because of their role and because they were often cheats and because they were despised by their community, they often lived outside of the Jewish community. And so here we probably had a tax collector who, though he was Jew by custom, Jew by birthright, Jew by family connection, Jew by knowledge, and maybe even some of his practices, was living his life largely apart from God. And so he has a come to Jesus moment. And he comes into the temple, and something has taken place, something has happened, and something has changed, and he realized that he's lived his life without need of God. And he bows before him, too ashamed even to lift his face towards heaven. And in the humility of heart, he cries out, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." The question, I think, for us today is, do you have any tendencies towards one or the other? Do you have any tendency to live in that sense of life under God? Maybe in the point, so much of our effort, whatever posture we take on, so much of our effort can often be about spending a lot of time trying to get people to kind of shift over to our point of view, over to our area. I've been kind of asking myself this question: how frustrated do I get with people that don't live their life like I do? Do I see them as my mission field? Do I see them as ones who need to know Jesus? Or do I see them more as my enemies? Where in me do I tend to think that I just need to go through the things? I've grown up in the church. I've been in church my whole life. And as long as I do what's expected, and people in my church family love me and care about me, and they're content with the job that I'm doing, but that's enough. Or maybe on the other side, do you have any tendencies in that life over God posture? You just need the principles, you just need the ideas, you need a few scriptures that you can throw around, and you can be successful with your life on your own. You can take these things and you can get the kind of life you need, and you can take control over the fears that you might have of the world around you. Does either one of these speak to you? Now, we'll talk about the next two, life from God, next week, and life for God. They're, I think, just as interesting. So if I didn't hit you today, you might find something next week. But what does it look like for you to just spend time with God? Let's pray.